She pushed through the wrong door with 30 seconds left on the clock, heels echoing on marble, and collided chest to chest with the one man in Seoul every gang, judge, and CEO refused to look in the eye. Kang Dien did not move. He did not blink. He simply stared at the woman gripping his lapel to keep from falling, and something inside a man built entirely of control quietly, dangerously, broke. Welcome to Naya Stories. Now buckle up. If slow burn romance with real danger behind it is your thing, hit subscribe and tap the bell, because new stories like this one drop every week. Now, let's get into it. Sonia Uday had rehearsed this pitch in the mirror for 11 straight nights. She had rehearsed it in the back of a taxi, with her laptop balanced on her knees. Rehearsed it walking to the bus stop in Lagos before she'd even boarded the flight to Seoul. Rehearsed it so many times that the words had stopped feeling like words and started feeling like a second heartbeat. 3 minutes. That was all Cho Enterprises had given her. 3 minutes to convince a board of Korean investors that her sustainable textile company deserved a seat at their table, a wire transfer, a future. She had exactly 90 seconds to find a bathroom before her name was called. The executive floor of the Cho Tower was a maze of glass and hush, the kind of place where even the air conditioning seemed to whisper apologies. Sonia's low heels clicked fast against the marble as she scanned door after unmarked door, panic climbing her throat like heat. She saw a door. No sign, no icon, just brushed steel and a sliver of light beneath it. She shoved it open without breaking stride, already unzipping her makeup bag, already rehearsing the opening line of her pitch under her breath. She did not see the man standing at the sink until she had already collided with him. His hand shot out and caught her elbow before she could stumble backward into the door. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. She was close enough to see the faint scar along his jaw, close enough to smell cedar and something colder underneath it, like the air right before rain. "I am so sorry," she said, breathless, mortified, already backing away. "Wrong door. Wrong door. I swear I didn't see." Her eyes dropped, finally registering the urinals behind him, and her whole face went hot with horror. "This is the men's room," she said, as if he might not have known. "It is," he agreed. His voice was low, unhurried, amused in a way that did not reach the rest of his expression, which remained carved from something like stone. "You're in a hurry. I have a presentation in 90 seconds, and I have never wanted the floor to swallow me more than I do right now," she said, already turning for the door, already laughing at herself despite the humiliation crawling up her neck. "Please forget you ever saw me." She was gone before he could answer, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving behind only the memory of her laugh, quick and real, and the faint trace of her perfume. Kang Dien stood very still for a long moment, staring at the door she had disappeared through. Men feared him. Women performed for him. Executives rehearsed their words twice before they said them in his presence, terrified of saying the wrong thing to the son of the Kang family, terrified of the reputation that walked into a room before he did. Nobody laughed at themselves in front of him. Nobody looked at him and saw only an inconvenience standing between them and a bathroom mirror. He found himself smiling. It felt unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle he hadn't used in years. Down the hall, Sonia burst into the boardroom, 4 seconds before her name was called. Breathless, lipstick reapplied crookedly, heart hammering so hard she was certain the investors could hear it. She smiled anyway. She had learned a long time ago that composure was armor, and she had spent her whole life building hers plate by plate. "Miss Aid," said the man at the head of the table, "we're ready when you are." She was ready too. She always made herself ready, because nobody had ever made the world ready for her. She spoke about fabric sourced from discarded pineapple leaves, about factories that paid living wages instead of starvation ones, about a supply chain that did not require anyone's grandmother to die of black lung disease to keep prices low. She spoke with the fire of someone who had built something from nothing, because she had. The room listened. A few nodded. One man in the back, gray-haired, unreadable, said almost nothing the entire time. When she finished, there was a long pause before the head investor cleared his throat. "We'll be in touch," he said, which in the language of investors everywhere meant nothing at all. Sonia thanked them, gathered her things, and walked out with her spine straight, refusing to let her face show the disappointment clawing at her chest. She had flown 14 hours for a sentence that meant no. She did not see the gray-haired man watching her go, memorizing her name. She did not know his name was not really Cho at all, but a quiet lieutenant who answered to a much more dangerous family, and that the young man she had crashed into in the restroom had already asked, before she'd even left the building, who she was. That evening, Sonia sat on the edge of her hotel bed in Gangnam, staring at her laptop screen, replaying every second of the meeting. Her phone buzzed. An email. Cho Enterprises regretted to inform her that after careful consideration, they would not be moving forward with an investment at this time. She closed the laptop and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She had come to Seoul carrying more than a pitch deck. She had carried 11 years of proving herself, of building a company out of grief, because grief needed somewhere to go, and business was the only shape she had ever managed to force it into. Her parents had died when she was 17. Their deaths never fully explained, swallowed by a system that had no interest in explaining anything to a girl with no money and no name. She had built added textiles brick by brick out of that silence, determined to become someone the world could not ignore. Tonight, the world had ignored her anyway. She let herself cry for exactly 6 minutes, because 6 minutes was all the time grief was allowed before she needed to be useful again. And then she washed her face and opened her laptop to draft 3 new pitch emails to companies who had not yet said no. She did not know that 4 floors below her hotel room, a black car was parked at the curb, and inside it, a man who ran half the underground economy of Seoul was staring at a folder someone had assembled for him in under 2 hours. Sonia Adi, 28, Lagos born, founder of Ade Textiles, parents deceased, 2015. Cause officially listed as accidental, unofficially the subject of a case file that had gone cold years before Kang Dian was even old enough to understand what his family truly was. He should have closed the folder. He had a war to manage, rivals circling like sharks that smelled blood in the water, a father whose expectations sat on his shoulders like a debt he could never fully repay. He did not have time for a woman who had walked into the wrong bathroom and walked straight into something he could not name. He closed the folder anyway, because closing it did not mean forgetting her laugh. The next day, Sonia woke to a knock on her hotel room door. She opened it expecting housekeeping, and found instead a delivery of white orchids. No card, no name. Simply a small handwritten note in careful English. You should not have to swallow no twice in 1 week. Try again. This time, walk through the right door. Attached was a single business card. No title, no company name. Just a name and a number. Kang Dian. Sonia stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to be flattered or unsettled. She was a woman who had learned not to trust kindness that arrived without explanation. Because kindness, in her experience, often came with a price tag hidden somewhere in the fine print. She set the card on the desk and told herself she would not call. She called by nightfall anyway, because curiosity had always been her most persistent flaw. "This is unexpected," she said when he picked up on the second ring, his voice as unhurried as it had been in the restroom the day before. "Orchids. A note. A number. Are you always this dramatic with strangers you've bumped into in bathrooms?" "Only the ones who make me laugh in a week where nothing has been funny," he said. "That's a low bar." "Then let me raise it," he said. "Have dinner with me." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "But you know I noticed you. That's rarer than you think." She should have said no. Every instinct she'd built over 11 years of protecting herself in rooms full of men who wanted something from her told her to say no. But something in his voice, some quiet gravity beneath the practiced calm, made her hesitate, and hesitation, she would later understand, had been the first door she'd walked through toward him. They met at a restaurant that did not advertise its name on the outside, tucked behind an unmarked door on a quiet street in Itaewon, the kind of place where the staff bowed a fraction lower to him than they did to anyone else in the room. "You come here often," Sonia observed, watching the way the waiter's hands trembled slightly as he poured the wine. "I own the building," Dian said simply. "Of course you do." She studied him over the rim of her glass. He wore his authority the way some men wore cologne. Quiet, inescapable. present in every glance the staff gave him. "What is it you actually do, Mr. Kang?" Because orchids and unmarked restaurants don't exactly say accountant. "Family business," he said, and something flickered behind his eyes too fast for her to name. "Vague. Complicated," he corrected. "What do you want to know first? The truth? Or the version that lets you sleep tonight?" She set her glass down. "I've never been very good at sleeping on lies, even comfortable ones." He studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't see. "Then I'll tell you the truth eventually. Tonight, let me just be a man having dinner with a woman who made him laugh in a bathroom." She should have pushed harder. Later, she would wonder if some part of her had already sensed the shape of the danger sitting across the table, and simply chosen, for one night, to enjoy the warmth of it instead. They talked until the restaurant emptied around them, about her company, her parents, the years she'd spent clawing her way out of grief and into something that resembled a life. He listened in a way few men had ever listened to her, without interrupting, without waiting for his turn to talk about himself. "Your investment fell through," he said eventually, no longer a question. She stiffened. "How do you know that?" "I know things," he said simply. "I could fix it." "I don't want charity." "It isn't charity," he said. "It's recognizing value other people were too short-sighted to see. And what would you want in return?" He held her gaze, steady, unflinching. "Dinner again next week. That's all I'll ask for now." She laughed, surprised into it. "You're either the most patient man I've ever met, or the most dangerous. Ask me again in a month," he said, "and I'll tell you which one is true." She did not know, walking out into the cool Seoul night with her arms wrapped around herself against the chill, that the danger she'd sensed in him was not a metaphor. She did not know that 3 men were watching the restaurant from a car parked half a block away. Men who did not work for Kang Dian. Men who had begun asking questions about the African woman he'd been seen with twice in 1 week. By the end of the following week, an anonymous investor had wired funds into Ad Textile's account, enough to triple production capacity, enough to open the export line she'd been dreaming about for 3 years. The email offering, it mentioned no name, only a holding company registered in Hong Kong. Sonia knew exactly whose fingerprints were on it, even without a signature. She called him, furious and grateful in equal measure. "I told you I didn't want your money." "You didn't get my money," he said calmly. "You got an investment in a company with strong fundamentals and an undervalued market position. My accountant would be very offended if you called it charity. You're impossible." "I've been told," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even through the phone. "Have dinner with me again. This time I'll pick the door myself, so you don't have to worry about walking into any bathrooms." She laughed despite herself, and somewhere in that laugh, a small crack opened in the wall she had spent 11 years building, 1 brick at a time, around the parts of herself that still ached. She did not yet know that his family had built the very wall around her grief in the first place. She did not know that somewhere in a locked filing cabinet in a house she had never seen, there existed a name that connected his blood to the worst night of her life. She only knew that for the first time, in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and seen more than a woman fighting to survive. Neither of them yet understood how much that would cost. The following evening, he took her to dinner in a private room overlooking the Han River, city lights scattered like something spilled and beautiful across black water. He was quieter than before, watching her with an intensity that made her skin warm even from across the table. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve something," she said. "I am," he admitted. "I've solved most things in my life. People, problems. I've never met anyone I couldn't predict within the first 10 minutes of a conversation. And me? You," he said. "I can't predict at all." She should have asked more questions that night. She should have asked why a man with his wealth traveled with 2 silent men who waited outside every restaurant door, why the staff at every establishment they visited flinched slightly whenever he raised his voice even a fraction. But the wine was warm in her chest, and his attention felt like sunlight after years of cold. And she let herself simply be a woman enjoying a man's undivided focus for 1 more night. It would be weeks before the first shadow fell across that warmth. Weeks before a black car she didn't recognize idled too long outside her hotel. Weeks before she understood, that falling for Kang Dian did not simply mean falling for a man. It meant walking, willingly, into a war she had not yet been told existed. By the end of the month, Sonia had stopped pretending she wasn't waiting for his calls. AD Textiles had grown faster than she'd ever dreamed possible. New contracts arriving from 3 countries, a factory expansion underway outside Lagos that would employ 40 more women who needed steady work more than they needed sympathy. She told herself the growth was her own doing, her own years of sweat finally paying off. And mostly, she was right. But she also knew that doors had opened for her in Seoul that would never have opened without the quiet weight of Kang Dian's name attached to hers. She had started staying in Seoul longer than her business required. "You're supposed to be running a company from Lagos," he said one evening, watching her from across a low table in his penthouse, the city glittering below them through floor-to-ceiling glass. "I run it from wherever there's Wi-Fi," she said. "Don't act like you're complaining." "I'm not," he said, and the honesty in his voice startled her more than any joke could have. "I like you here." "Careful, Mr. Kang. A woman could get used to hearing things like that." "Good," he said simply. "I want you used to it." She had learned, in the weeks since the restroom collision that had upended her carefully ordered life, that Kang Dian did not speak in half measures. He did not flirt the way other men flirted, testing the water, hedging his bets. When he wanted something, he said so, plainly, and then he built the world around getting it. What she had not yet learned, because he had not yet told her, was exactly what kind of world he was building it from. The first crack in the illusion came on a Tuesday, when she arrived at his office to bring him lunch as a joke, teasing him about working too hard, and found 2 men in dark suits standing in the hallway outside his door, their jackets not quite hiding the outline of something metal beneath them. She froze. One of the men noticed her hesitation and stepped smoothly aside, murmuring an apology in Korean too fast for her to follow, opening the door for her as though nothing were unusual at all. Dian looked up from his desk, and something crossed his face too quickly for her to name. There and gone, replaced instantly with the calm she had grown used to. "You brought lunch," he said, standing. "Who were those men?" she asked, instead of answering. "Security," he said. "Security carries guns in your hallway? Seoul is a dangerous city for a man in my position," he said. And for the first time since she'd met him, she heard the careful construction of the sentence, the deliberate vagueness of it. "What is your position exactly?" she asked, setting the food down slowly, her appetite gone. "I've asked you that 3 times now. You keep giving me answers that sound true, without actually telling me anything." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way he had that first night by the river, like he was trying to solve something he was afraid of breaking. "My family runs several businesses," he said finally. "Some of them are the kind you'd find in a magazine. Some of them aren't. Meaning I didn't choose the family I was born into any more than you chose to lose yours," he said. Quiet, careful. "I've spent my whole life trying to be more than what my father built. I would rather show you that than tell you, if you'll let me have the time." She should have walked out then. She would tell herself that later, in quieter moments, that she'd had every opportunity to leave before it cost her anything. But she had also spent 11 years being underestimated, being told what she was allowed to want, and something in her recognized a kindred defiance in him, a man trying to outrun the shadow of what he'd inherited. "I've buried enough unanswered questions in my life," she said finally. "Don't add yourself to the pile, Dian. If there's something I need to know, tell me before I find it in a headline." "I will," he said, and meant it, though he did not yet know how much telling her the truth would eventually cost them both. He kept his word in small pieces over the following weeks, never all at once, the way a man carefully hands someone a knife handle first. He told her his father, Kang Sun-woo, had built an empire out of shipping routes and shadows, decades before Dian was born, an empire that had swallowed smaller families whole across 3 decades of quiet, brutal expansion. He told her he had spent his adolescence being groomed for a throne he had never wanted, that every kindness he'd shown her since the day they met had been, in some private and unspoken way, an act of rebellion against everything his father had raised him to become. He did not tell her the name of every family his father's empire had swallowed. He did not yet know that Sonia's name would eventually be one of the names hidden in that history, waiting like a landmine buried decades deep. She fell for him anyway, slowly, the way ice melts, imperceptible, until suddenly the whole surface gives way at once. It happened for good on a rainy Thursday, 3 weeks after the Restroom, when she'd caught a fever from the Seoul cold, and he had shown up at her hotel unannounced, with soup his own housekeeper had made, sitting at the edge of her bed for 4 hours, doing nothing but holding her hand and letting her sleep, refusing every call that came through his phone, silencing the version of himself that ran a criminal empire, so that only the version who cared about her remained. "You didn't have to stay," she murmured, half asleep, fever warm. "I wanted to," he said. "I've spent my whole life being needed for the wrong reasons. Let me be here for the right one." She fell asleep holding his hand. And when she woke at midnight to find him still there, still awake, still watching her with an expression she was too afraid to name, she understood that something in her had already surrendered, quietly, without permission, weeks before her mind had caught up to her heart. The jealousy revealed itself for the first time at a gala 2 weeks later, one of the rare public events Dian allowed himself to attend, standing beside Sonia in a room full of Seoul's wealthiest, watching her navigate small talk in a language she'd only begun learning, with a grace that made his chest ache with something dangerously close to pride. A junior executive from a rival shipping company approached her at the bar, too confident, too familiar, his hand landing on the small of her back as he complimented her dress in English, too smooth to be accidental. Dian crossed the room before he'd consciously decided to move. "She's not interested," he said, voice low, pleasant, terrifying in its calm. The executive's face went pale the instant he registered who was speaking. He removed his hand from Sonia's back as though it had caught fire and mumbled an apology before disappearing into the crowd. "I could have handled that myself," Sonia said, half amused, half something warmer she wasn't ready to admit. "I know," Dian said, jaw tight, hand finding the small of her back where the other man's hand had been, an unconscious act of reclamation he didn't bother to hide. "I didn't do it because I thought you needed help. I did it because I couldn't stand watching another man touch you. That's possessive." "Yes," he agreed, unapologetic, dark eyes steady on hers. "I've never wanted to be possessive of anything in my life. I've spent years training myself not to want things, because wanting things gives people leverage against you. And then you walked into the wrong bathroom, and every rule I'd built for myself started falling apart." Something in her chest cracked wide open at that, standing in a ballroom full of strangers, the city's lights glittering through tall windows behind him. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap like and drop your thoughts below. Now, back to the story. That night ended with him walking her to her hotel room door, both of them lingering in the hallway long after the elevator doors had closed behind them, the air between them thick with everything neither of them had said out loud yet. "I should go," he said, not moving. "You should," she agreed, not moving either. He reached up and tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her jaw, his breath uneven in a way she'd never heard from him before. A man who controlled every room he ever walked into, suddenly unable to control the way his hand trembled slightly against her skin. "Sonia," he said, low, rough, like her name cost him something to say. "Dian," she answered, breathless, the space between them narrowing without either of them deciding to close it. He kissed her like a man who had spent his whole life being feared and had forgotten, until that exact moment, what it felt like to be gentle. She kissed him back like a woman who had spent 11 years building walls and had just discovered, with sudden and terrifying clarity, that she no longer wanted them standing. Neither of them heard the soft click of a phone camera from the far end of the hallway, where a man in an unremarkable gray coat lowered his phone and disappeared quietly into the stairwell, already dialing a number that belonged to a family that had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of leverage. By the following week, the photograph had made its way to a man named Kwon Young-tae, the head of Seoul's second-largest crime family, a man who had spent the last 2 years watching the Kang Empire's grip on the shipping lanes tighten, and had been waiting patiently for a weakness he could exploit. He studied the photograph for a long time, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Find out everything about her," he told the man standing across his desk. "Everything. Where she's from, what she wants, what she's afraid of." Kang Dian has finally given us something to hold. He did not yet know the full irony of what he'd found, that the woman in the photograph carried a grief inside her that connected directly to the Kang family's oldest and best-buried secret. He only knew that Kang Dian, the coldest, most disciplined heir Seoul's underworld had seen in a generation, had fallen in love, and love, in Kwon Young-tae's long experience, was always the fastest way to bring a strong man to his knees. Sonia knew none of this as she boarded her flight back to Lagos 3 days later to check on the factory expansion, her phone full of messages from Dian that made her smile every time they buzzed against her palm, her heart fuller than it had been in over a decade. She did not notice the man who boarded the same flight 2 rows behind her, quietly photographing her boarding pass, quietly relaying her destination to a number in Seoul before the plane had even reached cruising altitude. Lagos welcomed her home with its familiar chaos, the traffic, the heat, the smell of roasted corn from street vendors outside her factory gates. She threw herself into work, walking the floor of her expanded facility, with pride swelling in her chest as she watched 40 new employees learning machines that would change the trajectory of their lives. Machines her company had purchased, with money that had once felt like charity, and now felt, increasingly, like partnership. Dean called every night, his voice quieter across the distance, asking about her day, about the factory, about the particular ache of grief that surfaced every time she walked past the old neighborhood where her parents used to live before everything ended. "Tell me about them," he said one night, careful, gentle. "Your parents? If you want to." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Lagos skyline from her apartment balcony. "My father sold imported textiles," she said finally. "Small shop, nothing fancy, but he was proud of it. My mother kept the books and made the best jollof rice in the neighborhood, or she said she did, and nobody argued with her about it." She laughed softly, the sound catching on something sharper underneath. "They died when I was 17. Car accident, officially. Except the car was found burned in a way that didn't match any accident I've ever heard of. And the police closed the case in 11 days without ever explaining why, and nobody with money or power ever seemed interested in asking harder questions on behalf of a shopkeeper's daughter." Dian's silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. "Dian? I'm here," he said, and his voice had changed, gone very careful, very controlled, the voice of a man holding something back with enormous effort. "I'm sorry. That's a terrible thing to have carried alone for so long." "I didn't carry it alone forever," she said softly. "I built a company instead, gave the grief somewhere to go." "You built something extraordinary," he said, and she could hear something underneath the words she didn't yet have the context to understand. A rawness that hadn't been there a moment before. He did not tell her that night that the phrase, "burned in a way that didn't match any accident," had made his blood run cold. That a memory had surfaced from his childhood he had spent years trying to forget. A memory of his father's men returning from a job in Lagos when Dian was still young enough to be hiding at the top of the stairs, listening to conversations he was never meant to hear, conversations about a shipment gone wrong and a shopkeeper who had seen more than he should have. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself Lagos was a large city, and burned cars were not uncommon, and coincidence was simply coincidence, no matter how uncomfortably it sat in his stomach. He did not yet let himself ask the question that would eventually shatter everything they were building, because some part of him already suspected the answer, and some part of him was not yet brave enough to face it. By the time Sonia returned to Seoul 2 weeks later, Kwon Young-tae's men had already assembled a complete file on her company, her factory, her flight patterns, the names of every employee close enough to be used as leverage if it ever came to that. They had also, quietly, begun assembling something far more dangerous, proof, buried deep in old Kang shipping manifests from 2015, that a Lagos operation gone wrong that year had ended with 2 civilian deaths that Kang Soon-woo's organization had spent a decade making sure nobody ever connected back to them. Kwon Young-tae smiled when his analyst laid the connection out for him on a rain-streaked afternoon in his Seoul office. Kang Sun-woo's son is in love with the daughter of the people his father had killed, he said slowly, savoring every word like wine. This isn't leverage. This is a gift. He looked out at the gray Seoul skyline, already planning the exact moment he would use it, already imagining the particular devastation on Kang Dien's face when the truth arrived not as a confession, but as a weapon aimed directly at the one thing he had never let anyone touch. Sonia landed in Seoul that evening with a bouquet of yellow tulips waiting for her at the gate. No card needed this time, because she already knew exactly who had sent them. She had no way of knowing that somewhere across the city, a war was already being loaded like a gun, pointed at everything she had just started to let herself believe in. The first attack came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Sonia's return. Ordinary enough at the start that she almost mistook the danger for nothing more than bad luck. A car swerved deliberately into her path as she left a supplier meeting near the Han River, close enough that she felt the wind of it against her coat, close enough that the man who'd shoved her out of the way at the last second turned out to be one of Dian's silent security detail, the one who had been quietly, invisibly, following her for the past week without her knowledge. "You've had someone watching me," she said that night, furious, shaking, safe in Dian's penthouse, with a blanket around her shoulders that he had wrapped there himself, his hands still trembling faintly from how close the car had come. "Since the gala," he admitted. "I should have told you." "You should have told me a lot of things," she snapped, adrenaline curdling into something closer to fear. "Why is someone trying to hurt me, Dian?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence she saw, for the first time, real fear cross his face, not for himself, but for her. "There's a family," he said finally, "that has been at war with mine for 2 years. They've found out about us. In my world, the people you love become the fastest way for your enemies to break you." He knelt in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his voice raw, in a way she'd never heard from him before. "I would burn my father's entire empire to the ground before I let anyone touch you. I need you to believe that, even if you're angry with me." "I'm not angry," she said, voice cracking. "I'm terrified." "Then be terrified with me," he said. "Not alone. Never alone again." He moved her into a secured floor of his building that week, over her initial protests that faded quickly once she understood the alternative. Security tripled around her. Her flights back to Lagos were rerouted through private charters. Dian himself barely slept, spending nights reviewing surveillance footage, tracking every car that lingered too long near her building, every unfamiliar face that appeared twice in the same week on the streets she walked. She should have felt like a prisoner. Instead, watching him fight this hard, this relentlessly, for her safety, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in over a decade. Protected. Not because someone wanted something from her, but because someone refused to imagine a world without her in it. The kidnapping attempt came on a Friday night, 11 days after the car incident, executed with a precision that told Dian exactly whose fingerprints were on it, before his men had even finished securing the scene. Sonia had slipped out for 15 minutes, against every instruction, desperate for fresh air after 3 days confined to the penthouse, walking the private garden 2 floors below, with only one guard trailing a careful distance behind her. 3 men came over the garden wall in under a minute. The guard went down first, a blade finding him before he could raise an alarm. Sonia had time only to scream once, before a hand clamped over her mouth, and the world tilted sideways into darkness. She woke in a shipping container on the outskirts of Incheon, wrists bound, the smell of salt and rust thick in the air, a single bare bulb swinging overhead. Kwon Young-tae himself stepped into the light an hour later, smiling the way men smile when they believe they have already won. "You have no idea what you've walked into," he said, crouching in front of her, studying her face with clinical interest. "Do you know why Kang Dian fell for you so fast? Do you know why out of every woman in Seoul he chose you?" "Let me go," she said, refusing to let her voice shake. "Ask him about Lagos," Kwon said instead, standing, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "Ask him about 2015. Ask him what his father's shipping crews were doing in your neighborhood the year your parents died in a car that burned in a way accidents don't usually burn. The words landed like a physical blow. Sonia's whole body went cold. The pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed, suddenly, horribly, assembling themselves in her mind. "You're lying," she whispered. "I have the shipping manifests," Quan said calmly. "I have the payment records. I have everything, and I will make sure you see all of it, right before I use it to bring his empire down around both your heads." He left her alone in the container for 6 more hours, long enough for the doubt to work its way into every corner of her, long enough for her to remember every quiet flinch she'd seen cross Diane's face whenever she'd mentioned her parents, every silence that had followed her mention of Lagos, every moment she had mistaken for grief on her behalf, and had actually been the sound of a guilty man realizing what he'd fallen into. Diane tore his soul apart looking for her. He called in every favor his family's name had ever purchased, activated networks that had lain dormant for years, walked into meetings with rival families, and made it unmistakably clear that whoever had taken Sonia would not survive the week if she was harmed. His father, watching his son operate with a ruthlessness he hadn't seen since Diane was a young man first learning the business, said nothing, only nodded once, understanding exactly what kind of love could make a careful man reckless. It was Diane's father, in the end, who quietly supplied the location, a fact that would complicate everything Sonia believed about the Kang family in the days that followed. Diane's men breached the container facility at 4 a.m, moving through Quan's skeleton security with brutal, surgical efficiency. Diane himself found Sonia first, kneeling in front of her in the shipping container, hands shaking as he cut the ropes binding her wrists, murmuring her name over and over, like a prayer he was terrified God wouldn't answer. "You're safe," he said, pulling her into his chest. "You're safe. I have you. You're safe." "Is it true?" she asked, voice hoarse, pulling back to search his face with a desperation that broke something in him. "Lagos, 2015. Tell me it isn't true." His silence lasted only a second too long, but a second was all she needed. "Sonia," he said, "let me explain." "Is it true?" she said again, louder, the word cracking down the middle. "My father's operation was in Lagos that year," he said finally, forcing himself not to look away from her, even as the words dismantled everything between them. "I didn't know about your parents until you told me about them weeks ago. I didn't know for certain until 3 days ago, when I finally forced myself to pull the old shipment records because something about what you'd told me wouldn't leave me alone." His voice broke. "Sonia, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with it. I was a child. But my father gave the order that led to that car, and I have spent 3 days trying to find a way to tell you that wouldn't destroy everything we've built. And I am so sorry that you had to hear it from him instead of from me." She stared at him. Grief and betrayal, and love tangled so completely in her chest that she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "You knew," she whispered. "For 3 days, you knew, and you let me keep believing in this." "I was trying to find the right moment," he said, desperate now, reaching for her hands. "I was trying to bring you the whole truth, not just the part that would break you." "There is no right moment for this, Diane," she said, pulling her hands away, stepping back even as every instinct in her body screamed to fall into him instead. "There was never going to be a right moment. You just wanted more time before I looked at you, the way I'm looking at you right now." She walked away from him that night, back to her Lagos apartment on the first available flight, refusing every call, every message, every attempt he made to reach her, drowning herself instead in factory paperwork and old photographs of her parents, trying to reconcile the love she still felt for him with the grief that now wore his family's face. Dean did not chase her immediately. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his whole life studying power and its costs, that Sonia needed space to grieve a truth that had reopened a wound 11 years old. But he did not disappear either. Flowers arrived at her apartment every morning, never with demands attached, only quiet notes. "I am not asking you to forgive my father. I am only asking you to remember that I am not him. Take all the time you need. I will still be here." He spent those weeks dismantling, piece by piece, everything his father had built. He handed over shipping records to international investigators that implicated his own family in a dozen operations spanning a decade, including the Lagos operation that had ended Sonia's parents' lives. He confronted his father directly, in a conversation that ended with Kang Sun-woo disowning him in fury, and Dian walking out of his childhood home for the last time without a single regret. "I would rather lose everything my name has ever given me," he told his father that night, "than keep a single piece of it that cost her family everything." Kwon Young-tae, watching the Kang Empire collapse from the inside faster than he could have orchestrated it himself, made one final, desperate move 3 weeks later, sending men to Lagos to eliminate Sonia before the last of his rival's power crumbled entirely, determined to make her pay for a war she had never asked to be part of. Dean arrived in Lagos 6 hours ahead of them, having anticipated exactly this kind of desperation from a man with nothing left to lose. He found Sonia at her factory late on a Tuesday evening, going over export contracts alone, and the sight of him standing in her doorway, jet-lagged, exhausted, having flown 14 hours the moment his sources confirmed Kwon's men were already in the city, broke something loose in her chest that she had spent 3 weeks trying to keep locked down. "You shouldn't be here," she said, even as her whole body ached to close the distance between them. "Kwon's men are in Lagos," he said. "Tonight, for you. I couldn't let that happen without being here." Her fear registered a beat before the sound of shattering glass did, before 3 men burst through her factory's side entrance with the particular calm of professionals who had done this before. What followed was chaos, fast and brutal. Dinane placing himself between Sonia and the first man through the door, with the same unhesitating instinct that had made him legendary in Seoul's underworld long before she had ever known his name. Her factory workers, alerted by the noise, poured in from the floor below, and what Kwon's men had planned as a quiet elimination became instead a battle in full view of 40 witnesses who would later tell police exactly what they'd seen. It ended with Dian wounded, a blade catching his shoulder, before he disarmed the last attacker, and Kwon's remaining men fleeing into the Lagos night, 3 of them apprehended before dawn by police who had, for once, been given more than enough evidence to act on. Sonia knelt beside Dian on the factory floor, pressing her scarf hard against the wound in his shoulder, tears streaming freely down her face for the first time since the container. "Don't you dare," she said, voice fierce despite the tears. "Don't you dare almost die on me, while I'm still deciding whether I'm angry at you." "Still deciding," he said, wincing, managing a faint smile despite the pain. "Sounds promising." "Shut up," she said, half sob, half laugh. "And stay alive." He stayed alive. Kwon Young-tae, exposed by the shipping evidence Dian had handed over, and now facing international charges alongside domestic ones for the Lagos attack, was arrested within the month, his organization collapsing without him, the way empires built on fear always do once the fear stops working. Dian spent 6 weeks recovering in Lagos, refusing every offer to be moved somewhere more comfortable, insisting on staying close to Sonia while their relationship rebuilt itself slowly, honestly, in a way it had never had the chance to be built the first time. "I'm not the family that hurt you," he told her one evening, sitting on the same factory floor where he'd nearly died, watching the sun set orange over the Lagos skyline. "But I understand, if loving me will always mean carrying that history somewhere in your chest. I've spent 11 years carrying grief I couldn't put anywhere," she said quietly. "I'm not interested in carrying it alone anymore. I'd rather carry it with someone who's willing to burn his whole world down to make it right, than pretend I can carry it by myself forever." He turned to look at her, something breaking open and healing simultaneously in his chest. "Is that your way of saying you forgive me?" "It's my way of saying I love you," she said, "and that I'm choosing to believe that's stronger than everything your father's name ever cost me." They married 8 months later in a small ceremony on a rooftop in Lagos, close enough to her factory that she could point to it from where she stood, close enough to the neighborhood where her parents had once lived, that she felt, for the first time in 11 years, that some part of her grief had finally found a place to rest, instead of simply somewhere to hide. Dean wore no title that day, no empire behind his name, only a ring and a promise. and the quiet, steady devotion of a man who had rebuilt his entire life from nothing rather than lose her. A year after that, Sonia sat on the same rooftop, with a hand pressed against the gentle curve of her stomach, watching Dian argue cheerfully with a contractor about nursery paint colors, laughing at the sheer, ordinary joy of a life neither of them had ever expected to survive long enough to have. "Ad or Kang?" he asked her that evening, settling beside her, his hand covering hers over the swell of their unborn child. "Both," she said. "One name for where I came from, one for where we're going." He kissed her temple, quiet, certain, the fear and danger of the life they'd survived finally, fully behind them. "Both," he agreed. "Always both. You made it to the end, and that means you're truly part of the Naya Stories community. Thank you for your support. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be replying as always. And stay subscribed, because the next story is already waiting for you.